No pressure, Nick. It's only 2:02. Afternoon, Dave Borton, Bold Java, along with Joe Morocco from Cafe Imports. Let's see, what are we in? July, the coffee of the month. It's a Costa Rican Geisha. Um, Today, Joe will be roasting on the Hucky. I don't know if you can hear it, but it's just about blaring in my left ear. So we'll be looking at that. We've got some other topics we'll pick up as we go along. Joe, how about a brief introduction from you?
Sure thing. Yeah, I'm Joe Morocco. I work over at Cafe Imports in the sales department. I'm also the director of education. We teach a lot of classes on coffee, everything from seed to cup. Roasting is one of the primary focuses, and I've been roasting now since around 2008 and very much enjoy it. I've had the pleasure of roasting on a lot of different machines. So one of the fun things we get to do during this segment is roast on a few different machines every month. So this month we're going to roast on the Huki.
And I'm Dave Borton. We'll do introductions every month because we realize these are archived and might be isolated. So I've been roasting probably about 9 years, most of it home roasting on the Jean Cafe. Been roasting on Mill City's North Roaster 1K now probably for about 8 months. Roasted up this geisha, 3 weeks ago. Jumped on it. It's a different geisha. We'll be talking about that. Before we get any further, Joe has just gotten back from Ecuador. And I personally could benefit by an update on the upcoming crop. Joe?
Sure, yeah. Ecuador is a really amazing coffee growing region. Very small production. A lot of the farms there are really tiny. Blip on the radar compared to neighboring countries like Peru, Colombia, Brazil, for instance. The country of Ecuador doesn't really have as much infrastructure behind its coffee supply, especially for really high-end specialty stuff. So we've been working hard there for the last few years, really trying to develop some things with some producers down there. My trip was split between two parts of the country. In the north area, I was visiting a farm called Maputo, and also another farm called Perla Negra. Both of these farms are absolutely gorgeous. They're along the foothills toward the Andes Mountains, but along the Pacific slope as it slopes down, so they get a lot of moisture. Moisture is a benefit for growing, it's a deficit for drying, so we got to see a lot of fun stuff going on with that. And then the second half of the trip, we flew down to Cuenca, down to the very southern part of Ecuador. We drove down from Cuenca, probably about halfway between Cuenca and Peru, and visited a farm called Hacienda La Papaya, owned by a gentleman named Juan Peña. And Juan Peña is doing some amazing things. He's probably one of my top 3 producing heroes, I would say. He is investigating a lot of nutritional inputs to coffee, while at the same time experimenting with different types of variety. He has a very small farm right now, but he's going to be expanding that quite a bit. And another reason he's one of my producing heroes is he is working with a community around him that right now doesn't really grow coffee. They don't have much of an infrastructure for financial support, and he is raising coffee in his nursery, supporting those local people by helping them learn how to grow coffee and using his mill. And so within about 5 to 10 years, we're going to see a pretty large explosion of coffee from that part of the country as well. So I'm really excited about what I saw down there.
What does this winter's crop look like? It comes in here about November, right?
It depends. So when you're walking around a farm in Ecuador, Ecuador is on the equator, that's its name, and you will see coffees that are, the plants will have cherry, they'll have green, they'll have flowers, they'll have buds, all stages of development, and you'll see that all in the same branch. So it really depends on when the farmer for that particular uh, farm decides to go ahead and pick. And then they'll pick the coffee and then they'll warehouse that green coffee in its parchment and rest it. And they'll slowly add to that until they have enough to ship. So it kind of depends year to year when the rotation of that crop is going to fall. Right now, it looks like they're going to be ready to start shipping probably in August. We may see coffee as early as October, September, depending on how quickly the coffee gets milled and shipped.
Yeah, 2 years ago I picked it up in November. I didn't grab it this last year. And I know I'm generalizing, but the Ecuadorian coffees that year had more distinct characteristics than a Bolivian. It was a soft cup, mild cup, almost like a boutique Colombian. I don't know. Your experience with them?
You will get a very large variance of coffee characteristics in Ecuador. Since it is on the equator, depending on which side the sun rises or sets on of the coffee farm, depending on the moisture levels while the coffee is growing and while the coffee is drying, and depending on the variety. We see typical varieties that taste like geishas. We see Bourbon varieties that are just outrageous, and then we see other typica coffees that'll just taste kind of normal, or like a typica normally would.
Like a Bolivian.
Last year we had, up to that point, the highest scoring coffee that we had ever cupped at Cafe Imports come through from Ecuador. Juan Peña's lot scored 95, and that was our blind cupping score, and it scored that 3 times. So there are some crazy coffees. Of course, I want to say that was like a 5-bag chop. So it just depends on the farmer, depends on the area, because weather patterns there are so varied.
5-bag chop. You want to explain that?
5 bags means that's all that producer made of that particular lot of coffee that year.
So we're looking at 750 pounds of coffee, period.
Yep, that's right.
Very good. Okay, enough on Ecuador. We promised you a Costa Rican geisha. Roasted on a hucky. I got an email from Yaxter, Chris Moritz, that said it's hucky. It's not huki, because it's just like husky. The logo it apparently is pulled from, so hucky it is.
Okay.
All right. Let's talk about Costa Rican coffees.
Sounds good.
What makes Costa Rican coffees unique, Joe?
Costa Rica, similarly to Ecuador, even though it's not on the equator, it is a very narrow country, and it has so many different microclimates all within a very small area. Due to the narrowness of the country and the fact that the Caribbean Ocean is on one side, or the Caribbean Sea is on one side, and the Pacific Ocean is on the other, throughout the day, different weather patterns will affect the terroir of Costa Rica much differently. So you can be on one slope and it can be lush and tropical, and then go around that slope, and on the other side it's sunny and very dry. So within a community even, you can have a lot of discrepancy.
For us, we've got a mic difficulty. So I'll do some filling. Joe was just talking about all the microclimates within Costa Rica. I remember we were in San Jose. It was probably 76, 77 and sunny, and we just climbed up into the cloud forest, and it was rain out of nowhere.
Yep.
And it's an area where it rains 360 out of 365 days a year. I think what I'm going to do is share this microphone, and we'll just pass it back and forth. Does that work, Nick? Okay.
Okay, great.
Pardon me for a minute here. Joe, talk about the Tarzu, the coffees that come out of there, and then let's move into a discussion of geishas.
Cool. Tarzu is more in the central part of the country, kind of right outside of San Jose, and it's probably the most popular and well-known and largest of the regions within Costa Rica. One of the things that you see in Costa Rica, and especially in the Tarrazú region, that really sets it apart as well, not only the micro terroir, but also the fact that they have so many micro mills. When you look at other countries, the milling process can stymie creating micro lots, and micro lots really allow you to do a lot of experiments with variety and experiments with different plots of land and keep things separated. So since they have milling capabilities on their micro mills to go through a lot of different micro lots without stopping production for too very long, and since they do a lot of demucilagenating through mechanical means as opposed to fermentation, it allows for a lot of experiments such as planting geishas on their farm.
Joe, you've used the term twice, microlot. Most folks know what a microlot is, but can you expand that a little bit?
Absolutely. So traditionally, a plot of land would grow coffee, and that coffee would then be brought to a mill and sold at the mill level, and that would be blended with all of the other coffees from that region. And then that mill would possibly even blend their coffees with other coffees from the country at the dry mill. Micro lots are if you take a portion of your land or a specific portion of a harvest, basically a smaller subset of the coffee that you are producing as a producer, and you keep that coffee separated in some way for an intentional purpose, primarily taste, then that is referred to as a micro lot.
So that microlot you talked about before, you had a chop of 5 bags from the fellow in Ecuador. That could be a microlot all the way up to 250 bags if they had kept it separated and it was one section of a farmer's ranch.
Generally speaking, if I go to try to sell a 250 bag chop of coffee, people would kind of roll their eyes if I called it a micro lot, but it is true. There can be separation, there can be production that is very high quality at that size. Generally speaking though, a micro lot is anything from 10 to 150 bags.
Super.
And then there are various sizes outside of that.
So let's talk about geishas for a minute. Joe, trace the geisha story, and then we're going to take a look. Nick, did you lose me as well?
I'm up? Oh, great. All right, we can stop sharing.
Am I good?
So we're sharing microphones, but now we're switching which microphone we're sharing. Pardon me for a moment. Okay, so back to the geisha. It originates in Ethiopia, and from what I understand, and I'm sure that I may not be a little bit foggy on the details, I'm not a geisha expert, but from what I understand, it's from Ethiopia, and it was growing in Costa Rica. They had brought it over to Costa Rica to see what it would do, and it didn't really do very much, and so it kind of went by the wayside. Of course, this was before, and it was before we really were heralding coffees that had these really crazy exotic flavors as being super cool. This was during a time of high production, high yield, whenever coffees were more regionalized, microlots weren't really a big thing. Then in the mid-2000s, geisha was rediscovered. It was rediscovered in Panama, and it had these explosive characteristics that had not been recognized while it was growing in Costa Rica. For some reason, the variety and the terroir mixed together and created something that was extraordinary. So what separates one variety from another, of course, is the genetics of the plant, and the way that those genetics integrate the terroir into the seed that it's producing is what we then flavor. So geisha at that Panama farm found terroir that it was able to integrate into its system and produce very, very exotic, floral, explosive, aromatic flavors. So click forward now another 8-10 years, and we have geisha popping up all over the world because people think that it's that variety that has these nuances to it, and if they plant it, that they too will be able to sell this coffee for $50, $150 a pound. Whereas that may not necessarily be the case, because when you take that variety from that one particular terroir or region, then it's going to assimilate different components: sunlight, temperature, carbon dioxide, moisture, and all of the soil components into very different compounds than it may in another area. For instance, in Ecuador, when we taste those Typica coffees, they do taste like geisha. They taste almost like Yirgacheffe in a lot of ways. They have that extreme floral-like characteristic, whereas that is very untypical of Typica in a lot of other places around the world. But since they have access to different terroir, they're assimilating those in a way that presents a brand new flavor characteristic.
Very good. When we cupped this at the shop, we got a composite 88 score on it. Joe and company over at the importers gave it an 87. I think it's a solid coffee. We grabbed it. It's the first time I've seen a geisha advertised at less than $14 a pound. We've seen it in Colombia. We've seen it in Guatemala. This is a Costa Rican. It doesn't have the complexity that I find in a $20 geisha. There's a good fruit vein in it. It's got lots of florals, and the price is right. So we grabbed it from you. Gosh, we've got, what, 200 pounds left, Nick? Something like that. So let's get to take a look at it. Joe, this doesn't look like a geisha physically. Help me with that.
So even though this is a geisha, it's also a Costa Rica and it's also a terrazoo. And when you look at the coffee itself, outside of the occasional broca defect, when you look at the coffee itself, you have a very similarly looking coffee as a Via Sarchi or a Typica would look from the same region. It looks very small and dense. It has a slightly different curvature to the bean than you would normally get. It's kind of got a cup curvature. So I do recognize that it is different from a lot of the other varieties from the same place. But at first glance, I would not guess that this was a geisha. Anything you want to add to that?
No, it's just I had that same reaction. I suggested that it may be from an immature bush. Joe says no, probably more the terroir of that region, that area. So we're going to give it a go on the Hucky today. The other thing I wanted to do is take a look at volumetrics again. Joe very quickly covered how a coffee's weight is one thing, but its density is another. And it's a good tip to use when you're roasting. In this case, we're using a Brazil as a yardstick or as a measure because we know that's not a very dense coffee. So I've weighed out 200 grams of each, and we're going to check the density to see indeed that this geisha is more dense than the Brazil.
So this is coming right up to the 300 milligram line, or milliliter line, sorry. I don't know if you can see that. And now we'll do the Costa Rica.
The first one was Brazil. First coffee was a Brazil, and this is the geisha.
And you can see that this one goes quite a bit below that line. Not very much, but there's definitely a density difference between these two coffees. So I know that this is going to be a little heavier coffee in its density, a little bit more substance. So we're going to want to start with a little bit slower rate of rise in the very beginning after turnaround, and a fairly hot drum so that it has plenty of conductive heat to absorb while it's in that drying stage. We don't want it to dry too quickly because those levels of moisture on the outside of the coffee, if they leave before the inside of the coffee gets heated, then we're going to have that insular layer, and so we're not going to be able to penetrate heat to the inside of the coffee very well. If we were roasting this Brazil, we would want a lower charge temp and a higher charge gas amount so that that curve is a little bit sharper from the gas that we're adding. It doesn't need as much conductive heat, but we would want to get to that convective heat more quickly. But being as this geisha is pretty dense, we're going to give it a little bit slower time in that drying phase.
Okay, how are you going to do that? How do you go about that?
So we're going to start with a lower drop temp. And on the
Even though it's a denser bean.
I'm sorry, we're going to start with a little higher drop temp and a little lower gas charge at the beginning. I'm going to delay it a little bit, and I'm roasting to about full capacity on the hookah. That's another thing that I could do if I wanted to move this very quickly. I could lower my charge weight, so I have a very high charge weight, high charge temp, and that coffee will then take time to absorb that weight in. Yeah, let's walk through this hookah real fast. So the hookah 500 is called that because it's supposed to roast around 500 grams. You could roast a full pound in it. I've done that quite easily. Generally speaking, around 300 grams seems to be a pretty good sweet spot. We're going to go ahead and do a full pound today for you all. So the way that this machine functions is you have a hot plate down here. That hot plate is actually an IR burner. It's an infrared porcelain burner. It's connected to a propane tank. Over here you can't really see it, but there's a knob that I can control the gas flow. I can also control the burner plate to see whether or not I have the full burner plate on, the center of the burner plate on, or a ring around, so I can turn just the center off. I like to have it to where the entire burner plate is on, not just the ring and not just the center. Also right here on the back of the burner plate, I can actually see a gas gauge, so I know how many inches of pressure. And on this particular machine, I can go all the way up to about 5 inches of pressure, which is quite a bit. You can kind of probably see some glowing go on whenever I turn this thing all the way up.
It's a lot of heat for a little unit.
A lot of heat for a little unit. And then we have the fan. The fan is built into this. They call this the fume hood, but this is a fan, and we can just run. Let me clip this to myself here so I can be hands-free again. The stovepipe comes off. This becomes my hopper, and this becomes my chat. I like to keep this upside down while I'm roasting, so that whenever I get done roasting, I pull that off real fast, and I can just very easily swipe this right off into the trash can. A lot of people will roast with this like this, and then it takes a lot of time to get all of that out while your coffee is still in there cooking. And then you have your fan, which is running underneath. So I keep this upside down. The hopper becomes the funnel. And then this is my exhaust pipe, or stove pipe. This wood neck adjusts up and down. I have seen some machines, since these are all built individually, I've seen some where this is a little bit more some kind of a glove as you're handling it. I just usually handle it by the wood, and I'm totally fine. I don't really burn myself. We have a little cardboard box to set that on, so don't just set that on your table if you're using this machine. So one of you lucky people may end up with a shipment with little burn marks in it from our roasts today. Also, as you're cooling coffee, once I take this off, I want to move very quickly, get this off, and then I'll drop the coffee out. and I'll kind of spin this as I'm dropping the coffee out. I want to make sure that whenever I set this back on, I have some kind of stirring device so that I can cool that coffee just like a cooling arm will. Since this cooling tray has this wide area along the side, it won't cool quite as quickly on the sides, so I do want to kind of move the coffee off the sides. The coffee will cool much more quickly than a lot of machines will. This fan is actually pretty powerful. Along with that, I have what I call ambient temperature right here. The roaster is moving, as you can see, the drum is moving this way. So the least amount of coffee will congest right here in this corner, and the most amount of coffee will congest in this corner, and I call that my bean temperature. So right now we're at about 384 degrees Fahrenheit. The ambient temperature on this is listed as Celsius because this is not built in America. And America is basically the only, well, the United States of America is basically the only place that uses Fahrenheit. So
features that you would buy if you had to do it.
yeah, so if I were to, Dave is asking what I would do differently if I were to buy this again, if I were to add any features or anything, and I certainly would. I would add a longer stovepipe, which is now part of the deal. You can get that. I would also buy 2 of these fume hoods, and I would buy 2 of these hoppers and 2 of the cooling tray apparatuses. One I would leave completely plumbed all of the time, and the second one I would leave off to the side just to act as a cooling tray. Because right now, as it is, we're not able to roast in a cycle. As soon as I drop a roast, I have to wait for that to cool, get that out of the cooling tray, maintain the temperature of the drum while that's cooling, and then put it all back together and then begin to roast again. And that's a little bit arduous if you're trying to turn out roasts. Things that I love about this machine is I have control over all of the features. As you can see, I have a ton of power behind that too. Another machine that is compared to this machine is the Quest. The thing that I like about this machine more than the Quest is our 110 over here is only used for driving the drum. There's a second 110 that's used for the fan. The fan power on the Quest is just not very powerful at all, so you don't get to really use airflow. And also, that 110 on the Quest runs all 3 things: the drive shaft, your fan, and it runs the power, the burner itself. This burner being propane off to the side allows me to have a lot of fuel, so I can really push a roast, I can take curves really hard, and make adjustments. So I can do profile development to an extent on a machine like this, whereas I can also do a sample roast to a sample roast specs, and I don't have to worry about baking out that sample roast at all.
Let's talk about pour-over roast and espresso roast that you're ready.
Sure. So we're going to do 2 different roasts. We're going to do one roast that hopefully, if our hypothesis on the roasts are correct, one of the roasts is going to be more for espresso, and one of the roasts is going to be more for single origin drip or pour over, something of that nature. There's a lot of debate around whether or not these should be the case. Suffice it to say that what we're getting at when we're talking about roasting in these kinds of ways is, for espresso, sweetness is kind of the end goal a little bit more, whereas for pour over, we want to highlight some of the more aromatic acidity in the coffee, some more pop and zest to the coffee, and kind of dull that down a little bit for espresso. Both roasts can be used for either brewing method, but a more pleasing coffee is going to be a little bit more sweet through an espresso machine. And for us coffee geeks, we really like to geek out with those floral aromatics and really exciting citrus tones when we're drinking a cup of drip. So that's what we're going to shoot for today.
And you're going to call out the specs for me as you do this.
Yes, and as I go, especially since we're down to one mic, I'll kind of just walk through what's going on. Dave is going to be charting for us because we don't have this plugged into any kind of a computer. So we drew out old school. That's my handwriting. Don't blame Dave for that hideous handwriting. And we're going to go ahead and get started. Okay, I'm going to add a little bit more heat to our drum here.
What's the beginning temp, Joe?
I'm going to shoot for about 350. Right now we're at about 335.
I've gotten a couple questions about the drying phase that you're going to be using.
Sure.
Can you just elaborate a little bit on the higher drop temp with a less harsh drying phase?
Sure thing. That gives me a little bit of time to talk about that. So, a lot of people think that when you have a really dense coffee, that dense coffee can take on heat really well and that you should really hit it hard. That is, should actually be. The drying stage, let's stop talking about it in terms of drying and start talking about it in terms of being an endothermic reaction. Endothermic heating is an absorption heat. So conductive heat allows for us to have more absorption. Moisture in the coffee acts as a conduit or a wick to draw heat from the drum into the seed. If we're using convection, which is the heat of air that's moving past the coffee, that airflow can act as a drying mechanism. That drying mechanism, just like putting your hands under a hand dryer, can dry layers of cells in that coffee, which will then create an insular layer around the coffee so that heat can no longer get into the core as quickly. Of course, heat can also use that cellular matrix, the cell walls itself, navigate its way into the coffee, but that takes a lot longer and a lot more energy. So if we have a lot of air moving through here in the beginning stage and we have a really low drop temp, then that air is going to be the big additional, or the big mover of heat into the coffee, and that air is fighting against the moisture helping us get heat into the coffee. If we close that air off, however, and we have a really nice hot drum, then the coffee is going to act like a sponge and it's going to wipe up that heat off of the drum kind of. It's going to absorb that heat in. Coffee's going to touch the drum wall, it's going to touch another bean, and so on and so forth. And also, as it's giving its moisture off, if we have the airflow shut off, it creates a more humid environment in which all of the coffee can be during that initial endothermic stage. And so that heat will then be more readily absorbed into the rest of the coffee. We're creating an environment of that supports that endothermic heating. As soon as that part of the heating is done, though, we want to convert over to exothermic heating. That's when there's actual chemical changes happening in the coffee, and those can be facilitated or moved forward by opening up the airflow, moving out the moisture that we have dried off of the coffee. Now, Maillard reaction and caramelization reaction can take place. Neither of those reactions can take place with water present. So we want to get that out of the way. And as water is being created, water is actually being created as we break the bubbles. It's an off-put. As more steam is being created, we want to keep that steam rotating out, as well as all of the other chemicals that are being created. I hope that answers the question.
Low temp, low heat.
High temp, low air for a more dense coffee. Another thing about that density is that density, think about it in terms of being heavy, like it's going to take longer for that dense coffee to absorb the heat in the drum. So if I have a really high drop temp, that drop temp is going to have what I call an elastic relationship with the coffee as the coffee's pulling against it. If I drop coffee into a very hot drum and that coffee does not have density, it will turn and snap back up toward the heat of the drum very quickly. Whereas if I have a very dense coffee, it will sag that drop temp before it pulls back up. So I want to have a higher drop temp to facilitate that turnaround on a more dense coffee. Or else, if I'm not hitting that coffee with a lot of gas at turnaround and I have a low drop temp, then that dense coffee will never quite get.
Ralph suggests 385 to 410. Is that about right?
385 to 410. Yeah, it depends on the coffee and it depends on your roaster. And it depends on the probes and all of those different things. I've dropped coffee at 420, 425. I don't think I've dropped coffee below 385. But on a small roaster like this, your probes are going to be very, very different. So this is a very different environment that we're roasting on. The model of the curve can be correlated to a larger drum. So if I roast on this and have very good results, and I see that I had a very high drop temp for this drum, a very slow turnaround for this drum, an early crack versus a late crack, all of those things, those what I call milestones can then be assimilated into a different system. Just because I'm dropping at 350 on this drum doesn't mean that I'm going to go back to my Diedrich and drop at 350 and go back to my Probat and drop at 350. Correlated with those machines, it will be a much different drop temp.
How are you doing for temp?
We are right on the nose.
Pull it out.
Literally on the nose. 350. I'm going to remove my stovepipe.
How many inches of water you got?
We are at, we'll call it 1.3. And I'm going to go ahead and drop this as soon as I get my time rolling.
Exhaust shut.
Exhaust is going to be shut. So I like to pour nice and slowly into this drum. You don't want to congest your exhaust. Now, since this is a very small system, we just added a lot of cool coffee to it, and that's going to change the system dynamic quite a bit. So you may hear some clicking and clacking because your metal is going to be expanding and contracting around that coffee a bit.
30 seconds back.
So I'm going to go ahead and take this, put this back in, turn off my airflow, and we're good to go. And we'll get the 1 minute mark for our initial heat point.
500 grams. Mixed in 500 grams.
So 220 is our first temp. And I can feel this air coming out. You can actually get a duct and plumb this in, you know, out or out your garage. I have a buddy that has a very long one. He just roasts in his garage and puts it out the open door. So we're at about 1.5 minutes. We're looking at 195.
That turning point yet?
And I'm going to go ahead and crank this up to about 4.5 inches of gas. And we're looking at a turning point of 193. And we're at 194. So now what I want to see is a little bit of a slope to the curve as this is pulling back up out of the turnaround. And I know that hitting it at 4.5 inches of gas when my maximum is 5 sounds like I'm really giving it to it, but since we're at basic capacity for this drum, we can afford to really give it to it. Yeah, we just didn't have it wired. So we're not using Artisan because we didn't have it wired. Sorry if you didn't hear the question out there. Yes, our Artisan is right here.
Let's grab 3 minutes, Joe.
All right, 3 minutes is in 10 seconds here. $2.15.
Gas,
Still steady.
exhaust,
Still off. Through the drum. And another thing that you could do during this time while your gas is off is just switch the switch off on the fan. But I like to use this a little bit more. We are at 230. So our rate of rise right now is 15 degrees per 30 seconds. It's a nice rate of rise. It's on the lower end of a rate of rise where I'd want to see that happen, and that's exactly what we want for this more dense coffee. If we start seeing that rate of rise go up, then I'm going to start making adjustments on my gas to monitor that. Our rate of rise is kind of like our miles per hour.
Can you explain rate of rise to them?
Yes, rate of rise is we were at 35. Turn this to where you can actually. Rate of rise is how many degrees are you taking on per time increment. Right now we're measuring per 30 seconds and we're measuring in Fahrenheit, so we're moving at about 15 degrees per 30 seconds. We're at about 430, we're at 258, so our rate of rise has slowed just a touch. Great. I'm going to go ahead and pull out a little sample and look at it. We're still very green. I'm also seeing that some steam is pouring out of the port for my tryer. So I'm going to adjust that air down a little bit, right at 270 degrees at 5 minutes. This adjustment is probably about 50-50 airflow through the drum. And that allows for that moisture that's coming out now, as it's building a lot of pressure, it's just kind of regulating that through the drum. Pressure. If we build up too much pressure, a lot of times there are gaps along the front of the drum and the back of the drum, and you'll push out any chaff that's peeling off, and it'll go down into your burner bay. So you want to regulate a little bit. If you have too high pressure, you can start a fire, and that's not good, obviously. Now we are at yellow, and we're at 545, right at 300 degrees. At yellow, I'm going to adjust down my gas. 7.5. The reason that I make that adjustment usually around yellow is I know that I have moved from the moisture that was present in the coffee to that moisture now being almost vacant, and that's a loss of about 9% of the total mass of the coffee. And so that goes up in steam, and so I'm no longer moving 500 grams of coffee forward. I'm now moving much less than that forward.
Explain again.
So I'm moving less product forward in the roast. I now have less coffee material in the drum, so I don't need as much energy to get that coffee to continue on the same pace that it was going. If I continue to roast with the gas that high, my coffee will continue to gain in speed and get out of control. So now we're getting to where the coffee is starting to turn a little bit darker shade of gold. So that tells me that it's not only not drying anymore, but there are other reactions. Those exothermic reactions are taking place. We can actually smell the coffee since this is an open vent. I don't have to put the coffee right next to my nose to smell it. And now it's smelling more like cookies are baking than it was smelling like hay earlier. Another gas adjustment down to 2.75. And I forgot to mention this roast is going to be more for the espresso. Usually if I'm doing two different roasts, I want to do the more sweet, elongated roast first, as that serves to help warm up the roaster for the more quick, truncated roast that I'll do for the acidity building. 370 at 8 minutes. So what is the rate of rise?
30 degrees a minute.
30 degrees a minute.
Well, you're doing it all with gas.
Yep, right now. My airflow is totally open at this point. So I'm dropping the gas down to about 2. And I heard the first pop. And now I'm smelling it just because I'm curious.
First crack at 8:30, Joe.
Yep, first crack at 8:30. And what temperature were we at?
Missed it. My bad.
No, that's okay. So
394. So extract.
5. That's great.
What's your gas at? 2?
Down to 1.5 at this point. First crack is rolling.
In the hockey, you can really do the first crack.
Yeah, I don't know. You all might be able to hear that. Since this is not very insulated like a larger drum is, you can just hear it. It's almost like it's in stereo. Sounds like we're popping popcorn. So I'm going to want to really pay attention now to the coffee and see when it is going to be totally done, because I've got some maneuvering to do between the time that I want to drop the coffee and actually am able to drop the coffee. And I want to start that maneuvering just a couple of seconds earlier. I'm going to go ahead and kill my gas. Off. Gas is now off. So we're maintaining about a 5 degree per 30 second right now. First crack was at 8:30 and we're at 10:30 right now. So this, I think we're probably about there. I'm going to go ahead and call it. We're not going to stop time until I actually get the coffee out of the drum. So I'm going to move very quickly. Move this. And time was at 11 minutes.
Temp?
Temp was at 416. There we go. Now I'm going to use my spoon. Stir that around, make sure that it's getting cool all around.
What do I hear laboring?
As that heats up, that drum will sometimes rub. Since these are all handmade, every drum will have a little bit of its own characteristic. As they get very hot though, toward the end of the roast, there's a little bit of expansion. You'll hear it calm down and get louder during different parts of the roast. Coming through? What? Oh, sorry. So another reason that I turned that gas off well before I shut off the roast is that roaster will hold on to some of that heat, and now that I don't have air being pulled through it, I can get that roaster really over hot. So now I'm holding a nice 420 temperature on the roaster while I'm cooling off the coffee. And we're about there already. 500. Which is under a pound. I think I said a pound the first time, but
Yeah.
pound is 534, I believe. This is what I mean by wanting to have the secondary system, because right now we're just kind of standing around. But you know what?
But we're good at it.
We're good at it. That's
We're good
right.
at seeing it.
And sometimes it's good to kind of refocus and think about the roast that you just did and
Little zen.
do a little bit of grooming if you're so inclined. Not of yourself, well, of yourself if you're so inclined, but of the
I'm
coffee.
ready to dump.
I think we're ready to go, yeah. And might be a little easier if we use that. And there you have it. So we'll get this ready. You'll get a little bit of chaff on the screen, so knock that off so you don't suck it back through the fan. Put that back. Now we've got a piping hot drum. And turn my gas on. I know this seems kind of redundant and strange, but I'm going to turn my gas on with everything connected before I drop my next batch in, because I want to make sure that the temperature that I'm reading out is actually the real temperature of the drum, so that it's totally ready for the next roast. So I'm going to turn my gas all the way on, and I'm going to turn it up higher than I think I'm going to need to. I'm going to turn it way up, and then I'm going to pop this charger, and it'll spark it on. Let it get fully lit, and then turn my gas down to where I want my drum to be steady. Then check my temperature, and we should be right there ready to go for the next roast. We're at 354. I'm going to let it sit for just a second to make sure that it's not just a false reading. Make sure that the drum has really fully absorbed that level of heat to where it can hold itself there. Oh yeah, we're gonna be ready. Okay, so now I'm gonna take this off again. Flip it. You ready with the timer?
Yep.
All right, nice and slowly adding the coffee. Go.
Gas at 4 or 5.
Say that one more time.
Gas at 4 or 5.
1.5. I always look down this tube to make sure that all the coffee has gone in. I've heard reports from some of my compatriots who roast on a hookah that they get a little bit of coffee stuck in that tube. This drum does not seem to have that problem. Different ones will, different ones won't. Yes, we're going to turn that off. And I'm going to start this roast the exact same way that I did the other roast, because this first part of heating, again, is to get the energy to be absorbed into the core of the coffee. And we're going to see if it responds any differently due to the fact that this is the second roast of the same coffee.
Yes, 1.5. Air shut.
Correct.
With 190. This time we're doing a 401.
185. Yep. I'm going to go ahead and hit it. This time I'm going to go just a little bit hotter at 4.7.
Reasoning, you got to catch up.
We're going to both catch up, and we really want to kind of punch it and not have that roast extend out quite so much, because we're going to develop that acidity and not hold on to quite as much sweetness. Although I do like the sweetness. Hypothetically, that's what we're doing.
We're at 192.
So I probably should have held this a little longer before dropping in at that 350, because we are a little slower. But that is okay. Yep. What matters is how quickly we have that rate of rise moving once we get this going. What is our rate of rise there?
You've got 12 degrees, 24 a minute, Joe.
24 minutes.
Once you get that mass form, you'll be in good shape. You're up to 26.
Great. Okay. So we're at 14 degrees per 30 seconds.
Yes.
So I'm going to go ahead and crank this up a little bit hotter.
Give me a number.
We're going to go all the way to 5. All systems go. Look at the pressure. Still not really steaming too much.
Degrees a minute.
Okay, so we moved up a little bit in our speed. We're back up to 15. Or no. 17.
Yep.
Okay, now I'm starting to see a lot of pressure building up, so I'm going to open that up 50-50 at 270 degrees, same temperature.
I'm 1 block ahead of you.
So we're about to hit the 6-minute mark. At 284. And what is our rate of rise?
Ignore it, Joe. I'm off.
Oh, okay.
We'll pick it up from here. We have a nice long road.
Yeah. So we're at 300 degrees at 6:30. And we're at full yellow.
Right, ended.
That's right. So I'm going to go ahead and drop temp a little bit down to about 4.3. Okay, and what is that rate of rise? 17. So even though we're off to a little slower start during that drying phase, we're entering into that exothermic reactionary stage with more rate of rise per 30 seconds. And that's where we're really starting to develop the flavor in the coffee. So you can catch up as long as you are in that drying stage still, or endothermic. So now it's starting to turn that orange color at 335. I'm going to go ahead and open up my airflow all the way.
And you're opening the airflow to take advantage of exothermic.
That's right, yeah. We're bringing in air to move out all of the compounds that are being put off as smoke. And also that air is going to be a much better vehicle through which to bring the heat into the drum at this point. Okay, so we're at...
Play with the gas at all during that?
Yeah, I'm going to drop the gas after. I try to never make an airflow adjustment and a gas adjustment at the same time. I try to stage those two things. Okay, so we are at 3.5.
Degrees a minute.
How many was that?
28 degrees per minute.
28 degrees per minute. So we've backed back down to about 14 degrees per 30 seconds. Good, we want to slow down that rate of heating before we start entering first crack. I just heard the first pop. I'm backing down my gas to about 2.3. Sometimes you'll have one little pop. I don't usually count that as first crack starting until I start hearing a couple.
Talk about when you typically hear first crack.
There's first crack. I usually hear first crack at about the same temperature per drum. On this particular drum, 385 seems to be the mark where we'll start hearing first crack. Every now and then it'll be delayed or it'll be early. Just kind of depends on the amount of coffee that you have in the drum. You have to remember that the probes that you're reading out on, they're an average of temperatures between the beans themselves, between the drum itself and how it affects the thermostat or the temperature probe, and the air that's moving through that environment. So if I have fewer beans, my drum may be giving me a higher percentage of that average, or my air may be giving me a higher percentage of that average. Okay, I'm dropping temperature again. We're down to about 1. Or gas, I'm sorry.
Good question. I thought you might want to read it out loud.
Question, which is the better situation? To raise the heat during drying to make up for too low of a rise, or to lower the heat to make up for too fast? I think by heat you're probably meaning the gas pressure. I like to lower the gas pressure to make up if I'm moving too quickly. Okay. Sorry, let me think on that question here in a moment after I get this roast wrapped. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and turn this gas all the way off. And I think we're there. I'm gonna go ahead and take this off. And 11:15. So you can see if you don't have this ducted, the smoke that's being created, instead of it going out of the building like most roasters would, it's just filling the building. We love it.
So he clarified his question a little bit. He's asking whether it's better to be, when you're approaching the roast, if it's better to be underheat, if you don't know exactly where to go.
If it's better to be overheat or underheat.
Is it better to make up a roast by adding heat or lowering heat?
Ah, gotcha.
Basically, if he had to approach it any which way without really knowing, should he aim for the lower side or the higher side of a new roast?
So on a new roast, the question is, should you aim for the higher side of heat or the lower side of heat for a new roast, because you're going to have to make some kind of an adjustment. Early on, in my opinion, this is just my opinion, it's better to be a little higher on the gas and how much heat you're adding, because you can see some telltales early on in the roast as to whether or not you're going to be doing damage to the coffee. If I start seeing tiny little scorch marks, or if my rate of rise is starting to get out of control, it's a little easier to use the environment around you to slow that down. Whereas if you're just relying upon the gas itself and the drum itself, and you're starting too low, you may never really fully pull out. We were able to kind of pull this roast up and get it moving. This is a very small machine, so we were able to really punch it. And you could see that even that difference between 4.7 and 4.5 and 5.0 in the gas pressure at the stage that we added that extra gas on this roast really started pumping that roast forward. On a larger machine, it's not always the case that's going to happen. Depending on your roaster, Diedrich, you really need to plan ahead in advance quite a bit. So I'd rather start out with a hot Diedrich than a cool Diedrich. Later in the roast, it's the opposite. Once that reaction starts moving forward, it's very difficult to put on the brakes. So if you're going to make a mistake there, it's better for that mistake to on the cooler side, because coffee had put a wrap on it.
307.
Great.
And talk about what we're going to do next month. Strictly introduction to cupping.
Yeah.
And evaluation.
Next month, we're going to do an introduction to cupping and evaluating coffee through a cupping form. So we hope that you all tune in next week. You know, again, sorry, cutting your wave off. Again, your three major skills to roasting are knowing your machine, knowing your coffee, and knowing how to taste. Today we really talked about the coffee and we talked about the roaster. Next week we're going to hone in on how to taste. Learning how to taste better will make you a better roaster.
Super.
That's
Thank
it?
you, Joe.
And you did mean next month.
Our next month, yes, next month. So sorry.
Next month. Coffee in a month. And thanks, Nick, for the production in the background. See you next month.